A child in the back of a car, 41 degrees outside. The mother turns away for a few minutes. When she comes back, two kids, 2 and 4 years old, are unconscious in the southeast French town of Carpentras. They could not be revived. That happened this June, not in some heat-stricken corner of the Sahara, in France, and it was not a freak accident. It was the predictable endpoint of a weather pattern that meteorologists had been watching build for days. A pattern with a name most people have never heard: the Omega Block. Once you understand what an Omega Block actually is, you will never look at a heat wave the same way again. Because this is not weather behaving badly. This is the atmosphere getting stuck. To understand why this June was different, you have to throw out the way most people think about heat. Most people picture a heat wave as the sun simply turning up the temperature for a while, then turning it back down. That is not what happened in Europe this year. What happened is that a piece of the atmosphere itself stopped moving. Normally, the jet stream, the river of fast-moving air a few miles above your head, runs in a relatively flowing west to east pattern, dragging weather systems along with it. Storms come, storms go, hot spells break. But sometimes that flow buckles. A ridge of high pressure pushes far north. A trough of low pressure sits on either side of it, and the whole shape on a weather map starts to resemble the Greek letter omega, a tall arch with 2 dips flanking it. That is where the name comes from. And the danger of an omega block is not its strength, it is its stillness. Instead of sliding through in a day or two like a normal high-pressure system, an omega block can park itself over the same region for a week, sometimes more, because the troughs on either side act like bookends, locking the ridge in place. Underneath that stalled ridge, the air sinks. Sinking air compresses and warms, and because the system is not moving, that warming compounds day after day with nowhere to escape. There is no breeze coming through to flush it out, no front arriving to break the spell. The same mass of hot air just keeps reheating itself directly over the same cities, the same farms, the same elderly residents, and the same unair-conditioned apartments. This is exactly the mechanism that EU climate monitoring agencies identified behind the European heat wave that began building in the 3rd week of June 2026. A persistent omega block sitting over Western and Central Europe. Now look at what that stillness actually did on the ground. On June 23rd, Météo France confirmed that the country had just recorded its hottest day since national records began in 1947. 54 French departments, roughly half the country, were placed under red heat alerts. Temperatures in the Bordeaux region hit 41.9 degrees Celsius, just over 107 Fahrenheit. The Eiffel Tower and the Louvre cut their visiting hours. Trains serving London's Gatwick Airport were cancelled outright because rail infrastructure was not built to handle that kind of heat. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This was not even the worst heat wave of the year. It was the second one. Europe had already been hit by a record-breaking heat dome in late May, with temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees Celsius above normal and breaking spring records across Belgium, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and beyond. 2 record-shattering heat events in a single season, before summer had even technically settled in. That is not bad luck. That is a pattern repeating, because the underlying conditions that produce it keep reassembling. So why does an omega block form in the first place? And why does it seem to be doing this more often? This is where the story stops being about one stubborn weather map and starts being about the ocean underneath it. Scientists studying the increase in these blocking patterns point to the unusual warmth sitting in the surrounding seas, including the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. A warmer ocean changes the temperature contrast between the equator and the poles, and that contrast is exactly what keeps the jet stream moving briskly in a relatively straight line. Weaken that contrast and the jet stream slows down and meanders, which is precisely the kind of lazy, wavy pattern that lets a ridge stall out into an omega shape instead of sliding through.
Researchers studying this specific event have said the heat wave would have been virtually impossible without the warming already baked into the climate system. That is not speculation. That is the working scientific explanation for why blocking patterns like this keep showing up earlier in the year and lasting longer once they arrive. And the human cost of a stalled heat wave is not the same as the cost of a normal hot day, because duration is what actually kills people. A single scorching afternoon is uncomfortable. A body can recover from it overnight. What an omega block does is deny that recovery. Overnight temperatures across affected regions stayed above 20 degrees Celsius, especially in cities, meaning the body never got a real chance to cool down before the next day's heat began stacking on top of the last one. By June 28th, France's public health agency reported roughly 1,000 excess deaths tied directly to the heat wave, with officials warning the number would keep rising as more data came in from homes and residential care facilities. The Interior Minister said ambulance services had answered more than 122,000 emergency calls during the peak of the event. The people dying were overwhelmingly 65 and older, the population least able to physically regulate against sustained heat, and the population most likely to be sitting alone in an apartment with no air conditioning, because air conditioning has historically been rare across much of Europe, built for a climate that increasingly no longer exists. It was not only direct heat illness, either. As temperatures climbed past 40 degrees Celsius across France, people did exactly what you would expect. They went looking for water. And that created a second, quieter disaster running underneath the first one. Authorities reported 13 drowning deaths in France over a single weekend, as people flocked to rivers, canals, and lakes to cool off, many of them in water they did not know well, swimming in conditions or locations that were not designed for it. Heatwave-driven drowning deaths in France had already risen sharply the year before, and this year continued that climb. In Germany, at least 7 people died in swimming accidents over a single weekend for the same reason, including 2 separate drownings in Berlin. The heat does not just hurt you by being hot. It hurts you by pushing entire populations into risk they would not normally take. Here is the detail that turns this from a France story into a continental one. By the final Sunday of the event, an estimated 191 million people across Europe were forecast to experience temperatures of at least 35 degrees Celsius in a single day. That is not a regional event. That is more people than the entire population of most countries on Earth, simultaneously sitting under the same stalled dome of air. Spain's National Weather Agency issued red alerts as a mass of hot, dry air pushed up from the Sahara. The UK's Met Office issued its own red extreme heat warning, with London forecast to hit 39 degrees Celsius, threatening to break a June temperature record that had stood since 1976. Belgium hit an electricity price record of over €1 per kilowatt hour at sunset as air conditioners across the country maxed out the grid simultaneously. Austria recorded its first 36-degree reading of the year. The heat marched east into Croatia, Slovakia, and the Danubian Plain as the block finally began to shift. And then, almost as if to underline how violently energized the atmosphere had become, the same pattern that baked the continent broke apart into severe lightning storms across northern France in the immediate aftermath. And a Katy Perry performance in Belgium was canceled outright due to dangerous thunderstorms rolling through the Benelux region. A heat wave this extreme rarely ends quietly. It ends by releasing all the energy it spent 2 weeks storing. So what do you actually take away from an event like this? Not panic. Pattern recognition. The Omega Block is not a one-time fluke weather system. It is a known atmospheric behavior that climate scientists have been warning becomes more frequent as the temperature gradient between the poles and the equator weakens. France just experienced 2 of these stalled, record-breaking heat events in a single season, weeks apart,
each one independently breaking all-time national records. If you live anywhere in Western or Central Europe, the lesson from this June is not that you got unlucky. It is that the conditions which produce these blocks are becoming the new background state of the atmosphere, and the next one may not wait until next summer to show up. Watch the maps. When you see a ridge that refuses to move, that is not just a hot week ahead. That is the sky deciding to stay still, and staying still is exactly what makes heat dangerous.